You look very handsome, Brett.
Thank you. Yeah, I made a couple changes that you suggested.
Oh, great.
Okay.
Yeah.
You look great.
You do. You're going to rock this, baby.
Hello.
Hi, Sebastian.
Hey. I see your parents are here too. It's great.
Yeah, they're here too.
Good morning.
Hi.
Hi.
Good seeing you again.
You too.
Yeah,
we're
we're
very
excited.
excited. And we will mute, so.
No, come on. So 9 o'clock, ready to start?
Yeah, we're still waiting for Professor Blau, it looks like. Everyone else is here, all the faculty.
Let me see if I can reach her. The most challenging aspect of any thesis defense is to get the committee together at the same time. It's always been this way, and it'll never change.
Absolutely.
But your chair is here, Chris.
Yeah, Chris is here. Yeah, everyone's here. It's awesome.
Maybe while we're waiting, I have a very small, nice thing to share before we get started, which is, I teach some of the intro classes at Stanford, and often an important part of teaching intro is to inspire students. And the best way to inspire young students is to tell them what students who are slightly further along in their education career have been able to do. And actually, Brett, I don't think you know this, but I talk about your work when I'm trying to inspire young students with what they could do if they want.
1 second, sorry.
Wow.
Helen is waiting in the waiting room.
Waiting room. Oh, is she in the closed session? I think she might be in the closed session.
That sounds like closed session.
Yeah.
Okay, keep going, Chris. Sorry I've interrupted.
Yeah, no, that's fine. No, as I was just saying, when I teach the intro classes, Brett, I actually mention your work.
Oh wow. Yeah, I took your course. Your course helped convince me to go into AI. There's an amazing course over the summer. You were teaching CS 221, I think it was.
Yeah. So it's full circle. So now when I teach 109, we talk about what you've done.
Oh wow, I'm honored.
All right. Update from the confusion world of online video conferencing. She was hanging in a Google Meets that came with a calendar invite. Google is so kind to attach Google Meets to every calendar invite just to confuse us all. But she's on the way. I guess we can start a little bit, even without her being here, in terms of time of everybody. Welcome, good morning, or good evening, wherever you are. It's my incredible pleasure to open the thesis defense of our candidate, Brett Pupperell, today. I've had the privilege and great pleasure. Helen is here, fantastic.
Yes.
We just started with pleasantries before.
Okay, thank you very much.
It's good seeing you. Sorry for the confusion.
All right.
I had the great pleasure to advise Brett over the last few years, and I would say Brett is a person of unrivaled creativity. The type of things he worked on, from cancer detection and medical diagnostics to building a bicycle sharing app to building robotic hands and many other things, really shows the breadth of what he's capable of doing. And it's, of course, always a great pleasure to get to the point of a public defense, because it's the culmination of the education at Stanford and work of many years that lead to what I believe is world-class research in the area of medical informatics and artificial intelligence. I am his advisor, and it's bittersweet to see him graduate because I loved him as a student. He's just a really great human being, really caring, passionate, positive human being. But I'm going to hand over to Chris Peach, who is the chair of the Thesis Defense Committee, who is outside Brett's department. It's a tradition at Stanford that the chair not be the advisor, so that we couldn't do what some politicians like to do in colluding internally. And we have independent assessment of Brett's contribution as a researcher. So Chris, why don't you take it from here and tell people what's going to happen today?
Okay, thanks, Sebastian. I appreciate it. So as Sebastian mentioned, my job here is to make sure that all the logistics work out and that we abide by the standards of a PhD defense for Stanford. So what we're going to do today is there'll be several stages. First, Brett will have his public defense and he'll tell you about his work. During this time, I'm going to ask you please to hold on to your questions, because after the public defense, there will be a time for questions from the audience. After that moment, we're going to ask you very politely to leave, and then in a small group of the thesis defense committee will vote on Brett's defense. And if that, we'll first ask questions, and then we'll vote on Brett's defense, and then we'll let you know how that goes afterwards. So we're all very excited to hear what Brett has to say. And on that note, Brett, if you'd like to start with your public defense, please do.
Yep. So can you guys hear me? Can you see the slides?
Positive,
Awesome.
yes.
Great. Good morning, and welcome to my defense. I will be discussing my work in applying deep learning to two medical domains, dermatology and critical care. In both cases, I focused on data collected from ubiquitous sensors. To detect skin cancer, we relied only on images which any smartphone can take. For critical care, we used electrocardiogram and photoplethysmogram data, which the Apple Watch measures, as well as respiration and blood pressure. This story starts in 2015 when Dr. Novoa, a dermatologist in the medical school, posed a challenge to the AI lab. If deep learning can differentiate between hundreds of dog breeds, I believe it could make a contribution to dermatology. Can a photo taken from a regular camera be used to diagnose skin cancer? Dermatologists can often diagnose skin cancer by looking at a single photo, so it seemed reasonable that deep learning should be able to as well. This problem is important for many reasons. First, skin cancer is the most common cancer in the US. 1 in 5 Americans will develop skin cancer by the age of 70. When detected early, the 5-year survival rate of melanoma is 99%. This problem excited me partly because I am at a high risk for skin cancer, but mostly because it seemed like the perfect useful application of deep learning for images. Why classify cats and dogs when you can save actual lives? While my peers were busy squeezing out fractions of a percent better accuracy on well-manicured data sets, I decided a bigger impact could be made on a totally new data set. In hindsight, I was naive about the enormous challenge of creating a brand new data set. But it also turned out to be extremely rewarding. There was no ImageNet of dermatology ready to put into a cafe model. Yes, this was before TensorFlow and PyTorch existed. Cafe was the hot new framework, much faster than Theano and a nightmare to install. You couldn't just pip install it. In my day, we had to walk uphill to school both ways to train confidence. These were the days when most professors didn't even know what deep learning was. Fueled by Andrew Ng's deep learning lectures, grad students were fighting an uphill battle, convincing their advisors deep learning was more than a gimmick. It didn't have sample complexity bounds, the number of equations was fewer than the number of unknowns, and neural nets certainly weren't convex. Fortunately, my advisor is and always has been a visionary, so this wasn't an issue for me. I teamed up with another student, Andre Esteva, to take on this challenge. Within a week, we had scraped all the images from one dermatology website and fine-tuned AlexNet on the 20 or so labels that they were categorized into. It was exhilarating watching gradient descent, tuning the parameters with each batch of skin lesion photos, driving down the loss curve. I watched the terminal output for hours. Watching loss curves decrease is a high that few people are fortunate enough to get to experience. At the time, my dad happened to have a spot on his leg that he was concerned about. I asked him for a photo of it. The fine-tuned AlexNet said it was likely a benign seborrheic keratosis. I had no idea what that was. I showed the photo to Justin, one of our dermatologist collaborators, and he confirmed that it was in fact a benign seborrheic keratosis. After that, I was hooked. I started downloading every single image I could find online of a skin lesion. This started by simply Googling different keywords, skin cancer database, dermatology photos, and so on. With these searches, I was able to find quite a few repositories where doctors were uploading images of skin lesions along with the diagnoses. I continued website by website, custom Python script by custom Python script, scraping every single dermatology website known to Google. One company was not too happy about this, but that is a story for another time and place. Once I had all the images scraped from the websites I found, I tried reverse image searching with a few of the images. I found more repositories that I hadn't found from my previous search. These websites were all in other languages. My English keywords had been missing them. We were able to double the dataset by also scraping these foreign websites, along with labels in foreign languages. After months of scraping, I was left with a messy set of 300,000 images, many of which weren't even pictures of skin lesions, and whose diagnosis labels were in a bunch of different languages. It was time to clean it up. First, I started with the labels. The label varied from site to site. Sometimes it was the caption of the image, sometimes it was the title of the page. Basically, the labels were high entropy strings, and I needed a list of categories to train a ConvNet with. To approach cleaning them up, I first computed the length of the set of all labels. This number was the metric for how clean the label set was. The size of the set should be as small as possible, but no smaller. I started with a few simple heuristics, which helped significantly. I converted all the labels to ASCII lowercase and stripped excess whitespace. I translated all the foreign labels to English. I computed a similarity matrix between all pairs of strings using Levenshtein distance and merged the highest scoring matches. I applied all the simple heuristics I could think of that didn't require any medical knowledge. Then, with a significantly reduced set of labels, I started working with Rob and Justin, our dermatologist collaborators. I created a blank file for every disease label and put them into one big folder. I sent the folder of blank disease files to the dermatologists and asked them to create more folders and subfolders and place the disease files into them. Using only Windows File Explorer, they helped us create a taxonomy of skin disease. Now with the labels cleaned up, we had to do something about the images. There were a bunch of images that were microscope images of cells, of skin cells. To filter these out, I grabbed 50 microscope images and 50 skin images and fine-tuned AlexNet. It was such an easy task. The net learned to classify them with minimal training loss in only a few iterations. I tested the net on 50 new microscope images and 50 new skin lesion images, and it was nearly perfect at picking them apart. So then I let it loose on the entire data set and filtered out the microscope images. I did a similar filtering procedure for the images that weren't skin lesions. In this case, I used a random set of images from ImageNet as the not skin category. Now we had a gigantic data set of over 129,000 images and about 2,000 diseases. 2 orders of magnitude larger than any previously used dataset. By this point, Google had open sourced Inception v3, an upgrade from AlexNet and lighter weight than VGG. We upgraded to that net and fine-tuned with this gigantic dataset. We got amazing results. The results were too good, in fact. I looked more closely at the dataset and found a big problem. Our train test partition was contaminated with duplicates. This manifested itself in 2 ways. 1, the same image sometimes showed up on multiple websites, and 2, there were often multiple images of the same lesions taken from slightly different angles and distances, as you can see here. Further, some of the images had color-coded stickers on or other giveaway markers that made the diagnosis easier, as you can see here. We dealt with these issues in a few different ways. First, we analyzed the image metadata, which contained information on when the photo was taken. A simple heuristic of not separating images taken within an hour apart helped significantly. The problem, however, was that not all of the images contained the EXIF metadata. We then used Amazon Turk to detect duplicates. To deal with the giveaway markers, we used only those images for training and not testing. These heuristics combined helped to partition the data into fair training, validation, and testing datasets. There were still problems. First, the partition wasn't flawless. And second, the diagnoses weren't necessarily biopsy proven. Any doctor could upload an image to some of these sites with their diagnosis without any biopsy proof. A biopsy-proven diagnosis involves cutting a piece of the lesion off, slicing it, and analyzing it under a microscope, as in the picture in the lower left. This requires a highly trained dermatopathologist. To have a truly clean test set, we needed biopsy-proven images, and they needed to be fully disjoint from our training and validation datasets. To achieve this, we found two reliable sources of biopsy-proven skin lesion images. The first source was Stanford Hospital. I had to take a training course just to get access to EPIC, the database Stanford uses to save data. The second source was a for-purchase set of images from the UK that all had biopsy-proven diagnoses. With those two sources, we now had a pristine test set that we set aside. Since our diseases were laid out in a tree, we had some options as to how to train the net. In one extreme, we could simply do binary classification, where any disease with malignant as its ancestor was one category, and then everything else was the other category. But this throws away the fine-grained information in the label. The other extreme is to train on every single disease. The problem with this approach is that many of the diseases had only a few images, so the ConvNet had very little chance at learning the fine-grained label for our fine-tuning procedure. We made the compromise of using the finest grained classification possible with the constraint that each node contained at least 1,000 images. At inference time, we would compute the probability the ConvNet assigns to malignant as the sum of the probabilities assigned to its descendants. To evaluate the performance of our net at detecting malignant skin cancer, we calculate sensitivity and specificity. This way, we can directly compare performance with dermatologists. In the clinic, a dermatologist is faced with the decision of whether to biopsy a lesion or to not biopsy it. If they choose to biopsy the lesion, a dermatopathologist will slice it up and view the individual cells under a microscope. This results in a near-perfect diagnosis. Sensitivity is defined as the number of true positives divided by the number of positives. For a dermatologist in the clinic, that corresponds to the number of malignant lesions they choose to biopsy divided by the number of malignant lesions they see. Similarly, specificity is calculated as the number of benign lesions they do not biopsy divided by the number of lesions they see. For our network, we calculate sensitivity and specificity a little bit differently. The network outputs a probability. It actually outputs a bunch of probabilities that we sum up the tree of diseases. Based on that probability, we must make the decision of whether to classify the lesion as malignant or benign. Only then can we evaluate if we scored a true positive, a true negative, a false positive, or a false negative, and from there compute a sensitivity and specificity over the entire test set. In this fake example shown here, the threshold is placed before most of the malignant lesions. You can see that the classifier is sensitive because almost every malignant lesion is detected. The cost of leaning toward a sensitive classifier is that there are some false positives and the specificity is lower. In the case of biopsying a lesion, it's better to err on the side of cutting off a lesion that's benign than to miss a malignant melanoma. But why make a decision if you don't have to? By varying the threshold, we can calculate all the sensitivity and specificity pairs possible, effectively not making a decision on what the threshold should be. Here we did exactly that for 3 binary classification tasks. The first task is picking apart basal cell carcinomas from their benign lookalikes. Basal cell carcinoma is the most common form of skin cancer. The second task is picking apart melanomas from their benign lookalikes. Melanoma is the most deadly form of skin cancer. The third task is again picking apart melanomas from their benign lookalikes, but this time with dermoscopy images. Dermoscopy images are photos taken with a special device called a dermoscope that shines polarized light and captures information just beneath the skin. At one of our group meetings, long before we tested any dermatologists, Sebastian drew a picture on the board that looked like these figures. He said, if we can achieve that figure, we win. So we made those figures. We tested 25 dermatologists from Stanford, University of Pennsylvania, University of Iowa, and Massachusetts General Hospital with images of malignant and benign lookalike skin lesions. We asked them whether they would biopsy the lesion or not. We then evaluated their sensitivities and specificities. Additionally, we evaluated our network on the same images, sweeping the threshold to calculate all sensitivity and specificity pairs. These figures are the result of that analysis. What you can see is that for most of the dermatologists, there's some threshold for which the net will simultaneously achieve both a higher sensitivity and a higher specificity. In other words, for most of the dots, there is a point on the curve up and to the right. From this, we concluded that we achieve performance comparable to dermatologists. It's important to note that this doesn't fully capture what would happen in the clinic. A dermatologist would be able to ask the patient's questions, look at the lesion from different angles, touch it. Another thing to note is how varied the dermatologists are in their performance. We found that to be somewhat surprising. Maybe humans shouldn't be trusted with this task. Here we analyze and compare performance one step deeper into the taxonomy. These are confusion matrices where the true label is on the vertical axis and the predicted label is on the horizontal axis. The first confusion matrix belongs to the neural net. The next two correspond to individual dermatologists. We can see that both the net and dermatologists predict inflammatory for diseases that aren't inflammatory conditions. This is due to the broad nature of the inflammatory category. Further, these categories aren't mutually exclusive. A skin lesion could be both inflammatory and benign dermal, but ultimately diagnosed as benign dermal. Looking again at the confusion matrices, specifically these two boxes here, we can see that the dermatologists err on the side of diagnosing a malignant lesion, a pigmented lesion as malignant. This makes sense because the cost of diagnosing a melanoma as benign is much higher. One interesting side story. We put this net into an app so that our dermatologist collaborators could try it in the clinic. In one case, a patient had a small spot on their head that the dermatologist thought was probably fine. You might recognize the patient. The app reported a high probability for being malignant pigmented. Erring on the side of caution, the dermatologist biopsied the lesion and later found out that the spot was an early stage malignant melanoma. Since it was caught early enough, the spot was simply removed and that patient's life was saved. I am tremendously grateful to have had the opportunity to work with such amazing collaborators on this project. Here we have Justin Coe, Rob Navoa, Helen Blau, who's here today, Susan Sweater, Andre Esteva, and of course, Sebastian. It was an honor to represent Stanford with the leading Nature paper that was featured on the cover. Our work has been cited over 4,800 times, and it's still hanging up on the fridge at my parents' house. Okay, part 2. After that win, I felt like anything was possible. I wanted to try more difficult tasks. In some sense, fine-tuning an image classifier was fairly straightforward because image classification is a highly studied topic and tons of research hours have gone into finding the optimal architecture and learning the most effective set of weights. I decided for the next task, I wouldn't limit myself to images. What other ubiquitous sensors could detect life-threatening medical conditions? I bought every medical sensor and test I could find on Amazon. I got a scale that measured bioimpedance across the body between left and right feet. I got a fingertip PPG sensor that uses infrared light to measure blood flow beneath the skin. I got an infrared thermometer. I went to the campus clinic and got a full metabolic and lipid blood profile. I got a blood pressure cuff. I got an ECG that measures voltage across the heart between the left and right pointer fingers. I even got a blood analyzer that requires you to poke your finger and measures glucose and ketones from a drop of blood. Of all the sensors and tests, I was most excited by the PPG and ECG sensors because they were non-invasive and measured raw waveforms. This data seemed amenable to a one-dimensional ConfNet. I started reading all the papers I could find about this data. I came across a metric called pulse transit time. The idea is to measure the time it takes for a pulse to traverse the body from the heart to the fingertip. This can be measured with ECG and PPG combined. Pulse transit time is an interesting metric because it's highly correlated with blood pressure. If blood pressure is high, pulse transit time is low, and vice versa. The issue is that it needs to be calibrated for each person to reliably measure blood pressure. I thought, great, this is perfect for deep learning. I don't need these handcrafted features and heuristics. I'll just throw a bunch of ECG and PPG data into a ConfNet, and it will learn to measure blood pressure reliably without calibration. In the bottom left 2 photos, you can see I even made a custom pulse transit time measuring device using a programmable microcontroller and PPG and ECG analog sensors. The plan was to use this device along with a blood pressure cuff to test my neural net on real people. As with the skin cancer project, I decided the first step was to gather a bunch of data. It turns out hospitals collect tons of this kind of data. They collect other waveforms too, such as respiration and multiple ECG leads. Further, they collect blood pressure as a waveform. Perfect. I struck a gold mine, I thought. I downloaded all 7 terabytes of the waveforms and prepared them for fast training. Then I realized the ECG and PPG waveforms were misaligned. I looked into it further and found a disclaimer that the waveforms could be misaligned by up to 500 milliseconds. Pulse transit time is on the order of about 100 milliseconds. So this misalignment completely destroyed that information. I decided to go forward anyway. Maybe there was still enough information present in the waveforms to measure blood pressure. I trained ConfNet after ConfNet, tuning hyperparameters, changing the architecture. The nets were performing better and better. They were learning something about the waveforms that related to blood pressure. In an effort to boost blood pressure performance, I fed the ConfNet more labels to try to predict age and gender, for example. These additional training signals improved blood pressure estimation. So I looked around for more labels. I found that every hospital admission was labeled with various ICD diagnosis codes. The International Classification of Diseases, or ICD for short, is a taxonomy of all medical conditions, and it is maintained by the World Health Organization. This is great because it means I didn't need to collaborate to build a new taxonomy from scratch like we did with skin cancer. The taxonomy already existed. I fed the net 90 different ICD codes to learn. The net was still not very good at measuring blood pressure, but it was learning a lot about the ICD codes. Let me describe a few of them. So ICD code 785.51 cardiogenic shock. Cardiogenic shock occurs when the heart can't pump enough blood and oxygen to the brain, kidneys, and other vital organs. It is often fatal if not treated immediately. About half of the patients survive if treated immediately. Systolic heart failure is when the left ventricle of the heart can't contract completely. The heart won't pump forcefully enough to move blood throughout the body in an efficient way. A cerebral aneurysm is a weakness in the wall of a cerebral artery or vein that causes a ballooning of the blood vessel. A ruptured aneurysm can cause serious health problems, such as hemorrhagic stroke, brain damage, coma, and even death. A myocardial infarction, also known as a heart attack, usually occurs when a blood clot blocks flow to the heart. Without blood, tissue loses oxygen and dies. Liver cirrhosis is the irreversible scarring of the liver. In advanced cases, a liver transplant may be needed. So what can we do to detect these conditions with ubiquitous measurements? Consider this made-up example. Imagine there is an expensive test for some condition that does pretty well at picking apart positive and negative cases. This test is shown in the upper left figure. The red curve represents a distribution of test scores for positive cases. The green curve represents a distribution of test scores for negative cases. If you threshold the score of this test and mark everything that lands to the right of the threshold as a positive case, you have a pretty good test. This test is very expensive though, either in time or money, and is not widely available. An MRI machine, for example, is a highly capable, non-invasive imaging machine, and unlike X-rays and CT scans, does not harm you with cancer-causing radiation. They can map the internals of the body in high detail and detect tons of medical conditions. They are liquid helium-cooled, superconducting technology marvels and cost millions of dollars. You need a technician to run the machine and a radiologist to interpret the results. In other words, it's really expensive and only available to people with suspected problems or people who are willing to pay a few $1,000s for a scan. On the other hand, imagine you have a ubiquitous test that isn't as great at picking apart positive and negative cases. This test is shown in the lower left figure. Here, it's not so obvious what you would do with the results of this test. Setting a threshold anywhere results in a lot of false negatives and/or false positives. About 1 in 5 Americans use a smartwatch or fitness tracker. The Apple Watch shown is capable of measuring both a photoplethysmogram, also known as PPG, and a lead-1 electrocardiogram, also known as ECG. The latest generation measures blood oxygen saturation as well. Can we use the ubiquitous test to improve the utility of the expensive test? One could argue that an expensive, unavailable test, such as an MRI, results in an enormous amount of effective false negatives for all the people who could have been diagnosed had they received the test, but due to a lack of availability were never tested. Therefore, the expensive test has a low effective sensitivity. The ubiquitous test can improve the number of true positives detected by the expensive test if it is used for triage. That is, if the highest scores on the ubiquitous test are funneled into the expensive test, the effective sensitivity of the expensive test will increase. So what kind of data are we dealing with? For this work, we use data collected by MIT from a Harvard teaching hospital. Each patient is hooked up to a different set of sensors, but some are more common than others. I trained on every signal available, but limited inference to the 6 shown. These signals include 3 ECG leads, PPG, respiration, and arterial line blood pressure. Every signal is sampled at 125 Hertz with 8-bit resolution. I trained the 1D ConvNet with 2,048 samples, or about 16 seconds. Here are some example inputs that were detected by the net. We can see that there is a lot of complexity contained within these waveforms. For example, in the PPG signals for cardiogenic shock and myocardial infarction, we can see that the first bump is lower than the second bump. It's more common that the second bump is smaller or not visible. So this bump is shorter than the second bump. The boundary between these bumps is referred to as the diacritic notch. In the AVR lead of diastolic heart failure, here, we see an inverted T wave. That is, the small bump is upside down. You can see irregularities in the heart rhythm at multiple timescales. When I look at these waveforms, what I see is an exciting opportunity to throw a bunch of labeled data into a neural net and see what happens. I've defined what the inputs and outputs are. Now let me define the model architecture. Essentially, it's a 32-layer ResNet with one-dimensional convolutions. In the first 4 layers, the convolution kernels are separate for each of the signals. That is, each kernel only convolves over one channel. The convolution kernels for the 3 leads of ECG have shared weights. In the remaining layers, convolution kernels extend over all channels, but still convolve in only one dimension. Finally, a fully connected layer at the end outputs a 90-dimensional vector. This vector is fed into an element-wise sigmoid and trained with a sum of binary cross-entropy losses. 1 binary cross-entropy loss per ICD code. Training the net takes about a day on a tight NEX. Once the net is trained and overfitting is detected with the validation set, we perform inference on a test set. Here we can see kernel density estimates for the output of the neural net just before the sigmoid layer. The red curve represents the conditional distribution of the net output given that the patient is positive for the ICD code. In this case, the ICD code is cardiogenic shock. The green curve represents the conditional distribution of net output given that the patient is negative for that code. We can see that, as with the made-up example, it's not so obvious what you would do with the results of this test. Setting a threshold anywhere results in a lot of false negatives and or false positives. So what happens if we triage patients according to the neural net output? So let's assume that we have a near-perfect but expensive test. If we use the expensive test on 20% of the patients sampled at random, we will catch 20% of the cases. Then the effective sensitivity on the near-perfect test is only 20%, not 100%, because it wasn't even available to 80% of the patients. On the other hand, if we triage patients according to the neural net output and test the 20% most at risk, we catch 66% of the cases. That is over 3-fold improvement in the effective sensitivity. It's not hard to imagine an Apple Watch app recommending people get MRI scans or other tests if they are at high risk according to a neural net. Here I repeat that analysis for systolic heart failure. We can see that if we triage patients according to the neural net output and test the 20% most at risk, we will catch 56% of the cases. For cerebral aneurysms, we would catch 63% of the cases. I find it fascinating that these waveforms can provide any information at all about an artery bubble in the brain. For myocardial infarction, also known as a heart attack, we would catch 57% of the cases, almost a 3-fold improvement. And it's important to note that while a heart attack is very localized in time, we only have labels for the entire hospital admission, and we're training on waveforms that were taken throughout the entire hospital admission. Those could be well before they had the heart attack. For liver cirrhosis, we would catch 47%. We spoke to an ICU doctor about our results, and he was surprised that we could detect information about the liver. He hasn't seen any results in detecting liver conditions from this kind of waveform data. Another useful thing to know at the patient level would be how much more or less at risk am I than everyone else. In medicine, this metric is referred to as relative risk. In other contexts, it is referred to as risk ratio or base factor. In medicine, relative risk is usually used to compare exposed and unexposed groups. We can calculate relative risk as the probability that a patient has a condition given the output of the confident divided by the prevalence of that condition. To calculate the posterior, we can use the kernel density estimates along with the prevalences. It turns out there's actually a direct way to calculate the posterior using kernel Bayes rule. This avoids discretization and other unnecessary steps. And it becomes vectorized in Python. We can compute the relative risk for every patient in the test set. Let's group them by powers of 2. A person in the 2x group is at twice or more the risk of having the condition, but less than 4 times. A person in the half group is less than half as likely to have the condition, but more than a quarter, and so on. When we put every test patient into one of these risk groups for all 90 ICD codes, we get the figures shown here. Well, it's not 90, it's a subset of the 90. Looking at cardiogenic shock, for example, we can put about half of the 90 patients into a low risk group. How do we know these risk groups are valid? For each risk group, we can look at how often patients in that group were ultimately diagnosed with a condition compared to the prevalence. We can compute that for each of the 90 diseases. Here I show the mean and standard deviations of the actual risks associated with the target risk groups with the predicted risk groups. For higher risk groups, we would expect that the actual risk is higher than the target risk. A patient placed in the 2x risk group had an estimated risk of anywhere from 2 to 4 times. We do in fact see that the actual risk for high risk groups is higher than the estimated risk. So the filled in dots are higher than the empty dots. Similarly, we see that the actual risk for low risk groups is lower than the estimated risk. Filled in dots are lower than the empty dots. You might ask, what does the net's embedding of the ICD codes look like? Well, let's take a look. First, we pass 40,000 patient waveforms into the net, generating a 40,000 by 90 dimensional matrix embedding. We can now perform a low dimensional projection of the rows of this matrix with t-SNE. And this is what we get. Color-coded the conditions by which part of the body they affect. Red circles are conditions that affect the heart. So these ones. These conditions include cardiogenic shock, coronary atherosclerosis, atrial flutter, systolic heart failure, and myocardial infarction. Green circles are conditions that affect the brain. So these ones here. These conditions include cerebral edema, brain cancer, cerebral aneurysm, intracerebral hemorrhage. It's interesting that fracture of skull found its way into this region. Yellow circles, these ones, a couple down here. These are conditions that affect the liver. These conditions include cirrhosis, hepatitis, and liver cancer. It's interesting to note that alcohol abuse found its way into these conditions. Blue circles are conditions that affect the lungs. So we see those here. These conditions include pulmonary collapse, pneumonia, and acute respiratory failure. I find it fascinating that from such simple waveforms, this highly articulate semantic map can be learned. Further, it puts similar ICD codes together that may be far apart in ICD taxonomy. For example, in the center, we have ICD code 785.52 septic shock, ICD code 995.92 severe sepsis, and ICD code 038 septicemia. In the ICD taxonomy, the nearest common ancestor of these conditions would be the root of the entire taxonomy. But the ConvNet learned that they were similar semantically based on the waveforms it was trained with. Now that we have this semantic space and relative risk computed for all the test patients, let's see what the ConvNet predicts on a patient-by-patient level. Here, the ICD codes are colored according to the risk level that patient has. Actual diagnoses are circled in white. So this patient was admitted for altered mental status. And the ConvNet highlights all the conditions affecting the heart. So these are all marked as high risk, and all the conditions affecting the brain and liver are marked as low risk. And we can see what the patient was ultimately diagnosed with. And it's mostly the heart conditions. So this person was admitted for vomiting. And so the red conditions were the ones at high risk, and they were the brain conditions. And the heart conditions were low risk. They were ultimately diagnosed with a brain condition. So we can see this for multiple patients. So this patient was admitted for chest pain. And we can see that the heart conditions are red and the brain and liver are green. Myocardial infarction is a condition affecting the heart. And again, we can see the heart is lit up and other regions are green. End-stage liver disease. So yeah, the ICU doctor said he's never seen this kind of result before. And we have labeled this patient at high risk for the liver conditions and low risk for heart. And so there's many of these examples. So summary. My work is focused on applying deep learning to two medical domains, dermatology and critical care. In both cases, we used data collected from ubiquitous sensors. I see a future of ambient health monitoring, technology woven into the fabric of your daily routine, always looking out for signs of life-threatening conditions. My advice to new PhD students or anyone getting into machine learning would be to not restrict yourself to problems everyone else is trying to solve. It can be more challenging to venture off the beaten path, but it's often far more rewarding. There's a famous quote I really like, and it goes, "And those who were seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music." I'd like to thank all my awesome lab mates and lab alumni. So we couldn't have pulled off that Nature paper without Andre. Varun, he's given me some amazing advice over the years. I've had many great conversations with Dave, discussing the most detailed and nuanced of problems. Zaid, Jake, Alex, they're all great people, amazing people. And of course, it goes without saying that I have the best advisor in the world. He has revolutionized my way of thinking, and yet has always given me the freedom to learn and grow from my own mistakes and successes. I'm very grateful for having had the opportunity to have worked alongside so many amazing people. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank my awesome and supportive family. Between my dad giving me story problems as a kid, and my mom paying me for A's on my report card, they taught me to keep my mind busy. Their praise for academic achievements led me here today, giving a PhD defense. I'm very thankful to my amazing family. And of course, I'd like to thank my beautiful girlfriend, Akila, for encouraging me to power through this last mile of the degree. So with that, I'd like to open up for questions.
Thank you very much, Brett, for the presentation. So at this point, we'll open up the floor for questions from the public. So for those on the Defense Committee, we'll ask you to hold your questions for the closed session.
Hey, Brett, I have a question. I was wondering if you've noticed.
Oh, hey, Sam.
Hey, I was wondering if you've noticed that since you started your work that not just outside of Stanford, but other medical systems are starting to get on the page of making their data much more usable for projects like this.
Yeah, I think that people are doing that. And unfortunately, in our case, we couldn't release the data set. A lot of people have been asking for us to release it. I shared it with some faculty at Stanford, but ultimately, there's just private health issues with this medical data. Can't share it very broadly, but I do see a trend where this kind of data is, like UK Biobank is an example where you can get access to 500,000 MRI scans and genomics and every medical information imaginable. And then the US has another push in this direction, the All of Us initiative. So yeah, I do see that becoming more of a trend.
It looks like there's a question in the chat from Aru. It looks like, Aru would like to know how you manage false positives and false negatives.
How do we manage false positives and false negatives? Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky issue. I mean, I think that's at the core of why this is mostly an academic result and not a business, because then you would have to, get FDA approval, and there would be a lot of scrutiny for this.
To ask another question, you used a lot of metrics that I think, well, in traditional machine learning problems, we're looking at metrics like precision and recall. Were there some, but that wasn't really relevant to your task at all, where you're actually dealing with people's lives. Were there any metrics that you found were not really being represented in the traditional machine learning literature that you had to introduce into your study of diagnoses that were actually consequential, such as we saw relative risk? Were there any others?
That's a good question. Yeah, I used relative risk. I tried to stick to well-known metrics. It's easy to invent your own metrics. But at the same time, it's hard to. A lot of people want 99% sensitive and specific. So how do you navigate that? So yeah, relative risk is a metric that exists for. It's used for the drug industry. So I use that metric. Yeah, I tried to stick to. It's not good to invent everything. You want to stick to some things people came up with.
There's a nice note from your sister in the chat.
Oh, your sister is your programming. Would you say your sister is your program? Oh yeah, he majored in computer science, and my dad, he did computer science. So yeah, our whole family's kind of computer science.
Arguably the best programmer in the family, but
you brought Chewbacca.
Yeah, I did.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that inspiration, Alexis. I always needed that inspiration from my little sister growing up to pursue computer science. Thanks for getting me into the field.
Of course, anytime.
Okay, are there other questions?
Now, I want to thank Helen Blau and John Pauli and Benji Rowe to be on the Defense Committee here. I unfortunately forgot to do this in the beginning, but let me correct my mistake here. You've been amazing, and Helen in particular, you've been an amazing partner in all of this. I can't overemphasize how important your leadership has been in all this. And I want to thank Brett and for doing, I believe, a great job with this presentation. I hope you all were moved to tears as I am listening about not just the results, but also the story that led to those results. And I want to thank the Stanford community for being such a great community of people, such an open-minded community. I think Stanford is the place where we always think outside the box and do something that's different from the rest of the world. And we typically tend to be the first. And this is an example of where Brett really thought outside the box and made some amazing results happen. Thank you everybody for coming for the defense. As Chris, our chair, mentioned, we have a 5-minute bio break, and then we'll meet among the committee in a separate Zoom link. The procedure is that the committee will ask additional questions and give additional guidance for the document to be written. And then eventually the committee meets among themselves and pronounces the result of this election.
I want to congratulate Brett on a beautiful presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Elegant work and presented in a very accessible way, which is a gift as well.
Thanks so much. It's great to see you.
Pleasure.
And yeah, see the rest of the committee in the closed session.
Okay.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks, Sebastian.
Right. See you guys soon.